Presentations. Oh, there we are. Happy days. Neil, shout at me if I run over, will you? You shout at me if I run over. Sadly. Right, okay, so this is what music is it?
Yeah, I don't think it's working. You can just use it.
Okay, fine. Brilliant.
Right, so next welcome Kate Mayne from North Shropshire Farmers and Dr. Brown. They're going to talk about peatland restoration and opportunities and challenges from the landowner's perspective.
So, yeah, we're sharing this pitch, so I'm going to do my 10 minutes and just talking very generally about the peatland within farming systems in North Shropshire. I want to sort of show you a few examples from the farmers within our group and people I work with, and then just sort of what I envisage as the sort of needs in terms of unlocking some of these sites. And then Neil's going to talk about a specific project that he's got going on his farm. So I think Robert's demonstrated this brilliantly already, but the peat bodies in North Shropshire are very small, generally speaking. And when we're talking about the opportunities, as much as that can be quite challenging, I think it's also quite a big opportunity, because quite often we've got individual landowners owning what is a very challenging bit of ground on their farm. So quite often a peat body will be already put in woodland, for example, or it'll be taken out and put into sort of, you know, a bit of summer grazing where they kick the cows down there in the, you know, when it's dried up sort of thing. You know, a lot of these sites have been drained in the past, and you know, the incentive to redrain them, you know, because they might have the drainage systems get choked up with ochre and the like. Sometimes the incentives to redrain those can be limited at the moment because of the challenges of farming that particular land. So that in effect is an opportunity to re-wet these sites, because, you know, that perhaps they're seen by farmers as a tricky bit of land. If there's another option for it, they'll take it. And, you know, one of the points I wanted to make was it's not the Cambridgeshire Fens. We're not talking about hundreds of acres of pancake flat peatlands. These are, you know, sporadic bits of ground that are never growing salads at really high grades. That's a really challenging landscape to restore peat on, I think, because of what those peatlands are producing in food terms. But in Shropshire, it's a little bit different. Now, the flip side to this is that you know, a challenge of our peatlands is also the size of them. So, you know, a lot of these peat bodies that I've been made aware of, they're not mapped. We can't see them on a map. So unlocking sort of funding for those can be quite difficult, because in effect they don't exist because they're not on magic. You know, it's that sort of thing for us. There's also kind of, you know, challenges around the multiple landowner situation that sort of Rennie's touched on. We've got a few biggish sort of peat bodies. So that's on the far side over there. That's Baggy Moor on the River Perry, where my family have some land on there. The one in the middle there, that's where Neil's farm is. There's a peat body there. It's not as big as that in reality. The mapping isn't particularly accurate on a lot of this. And then just sneaking on the edge of my picture here, I've kind of half chopped it off, but this is the Wealdmoors. So this is where Harper Adams have got some peatland here, and I'm kind of gamekeeper turned poacher, because I'm also a clerk to the Drainage Authority that works in that area as well. But the multiple landowner thing, I think, in Shropshire is particularly challenging, because we have a huge, you know, we're really diverse in farming terms in Shropshire. We've got dairy, we've got beef, we've got sheep, we've got poultry, we've got, you know, some really productive arable systems that are growing roots and cereals and the rest. So trying to get a bunch of farmers that have all got different aspirations and sort of different needs from their land, all to be pulling in the same direction on a large peat body is really quite tough. And, you know, trying to move all those people together is, yeah, it's not an easy job. The other thing about North Shropshire peatlands is that they are set amongst some really quite productive farmland. So our land around the peat sites is sort of good deep, sandy loams and sandy clay loams and the like. So we're good at producing food around here. And the result of that is that our land prices are quite high, and the rental market is really quite lively. Now, if you are asking a farmer to take, I don't know how many acres it is, but take a proportion of his or her farming business out, what you're doing in effect is you're undermining their, argument for the combine, or you're undermining their grazing platform for their livestock. So running in their existing farm business, they've then got to either replace that by going out onto this very lively market for land, which can be really expensive, or they've got to kind of, in effect, relook at their whole farming system and what they're doing. And I think that in itself is probably one of the biggest challenges I see around restoring some of this peatland, because this peat is, part of a farming business at the moment, and taking it out, it can have quite sort of significant impacts. I just wanted to sort of show you a few of the sites that I've been working with. There's a handful here, but there's lots more out there. So these are 2 peat sites. Both of them are unmapped, so they don't exist in mapping terms. And they're also quite small. So when I've talked to Natural England about these, they've said, not a lot we can do for you, Kate, because they don't really stand a countryside stewardship scheme on their own, a hectare here and a hectare there. It's not really enough for us to be able to get a sort of a higher tier agreement for fen creation. These sites are ripe. The landowners are really going, Kate, come on, let's do something about this peat. And we've got nowhere to go at the moment. So we need to unlock opportunities on these little diddy sites that people are, ready to do something with. This is Baggymoor, and I'll talk about Baggymoor because, but it's very similar to the Wealdmoors, I think, in a lot of respects. So it's got artificial drainage systems. It was, large swathes of these areas would have been drained in the 70s through grant schemes, government grant schemes. So my family farm where the peat shrinkage is, doesn't sound good, does it? But where the peat shrinkage is where my family farm. That was actually pump drained through a funding system back in the 70s. So that has actually shrunk more than a lot of Baggymoor, because the drainage started there before the river was canalised in the early 80s. So when the river was lowered, all of a sudden we had a very, very leaky peat system here, and we've tried re-wetting the land over on the left-hand side of this picture in the past through a high-level stewardship scheme. We just can't hold on to water on that site. It's really, really difficult. Elsewhere on Baggymoor, though, there's various farmers I'm talking to who have got peat that does stand wet. But what our challenge is going to be is keeping the water on those sites, penning it, so that we're not impacting on the guys that aren't, interested at this point in time. But also, sorry to bore you with the same old thing, but we need decent incentives. And at the moment, the financial potential to unlock these sites is not quite there, I don't think. I'm getting a few through at the moment, and Neil will talk about his, but it needs to progress a little bit more, I think, for us to unlock more of these schemes. This is Wrighton Moss. So that was our bit bad peat situation as my family farm. This is a good one. So this is Wrighton Moss. We restored this peatland through a project that Robert was working on, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, Robert, something like that. So this was, a lot of trees were felled in this area, and we bunged up the drains and the way to go. These things are not simple. I mean, this is the extremes of what we've been dealing with. So that was water levels, I don't know, quite a few years ago now, but they were incredibly high, and we were losing some very large trees on the peripheries of this area, which really upset my dad, because he loves his trees, and he was watching these things, massive old trees falling over. So it kind of upset him quite a lot. But the other extreme to this is a photograph taken end of last week. It's bone dry at the moment. Now, you can see we are capable of growing sphagnum moss. You can see that it's bleached in the middle there. So we know what we can do on this site. We know what we're capable of, but managing it isn't block up the drains and walk off. And we haven't understood that as farmers. And I don't think at the moment there's quite the support mechanism to help farmers understand, A, what it should look like, because in effect it's a woodland that's growing sphagnum moss. I don't know, is that a thing? I don't really understand. But also, you know, we need to acknowledge this sort of long-term management and support that farmers are going to need to make these sites do what they need to do. So just quickly, and then I'll let Neil talk about his project. One of the farmers that wanted to be here today but couldn't be rang me up to say, Kate, you've got to tell them this. And what he wanted to express, he's a peatland owner, and what he wanted to express was this idea that when you take land out of agricultural production and put it into trees, it's trees for good then. You know, we have to restock with trees once you fell those trees. And that in itself is a really big consideration for farmers, because in effect, that farmer's then taking that land out of his farming platform for a long period of time. You know, income from woodland, even if it's conifer or whatever, is a slow process. So that's a really important consideration that needs to be got across. We really need long-term contracts and commitments that recognise the sort of public goods delivery that we're achieving, but over much longer periods of time. So one of the things that's happened just recently, just to sort of open up a challenge that we're experiencing in North Shropshire at the moment, we've got a new power line in the north. Now, what this power line has meant is there's lots of solar panel companies out there looking for land to put panels on. And where do we put panels? We put it on the stuff that's less productive, that isn't going to undermine our farm businesses. These guys are offering 30-year contracts on money that, you know, wipes the floor with what I can get them through a higher tier stewardship scheme. So that's the sort of environment that we're working in. And those are the sorts of, you know, considerations that we need to make when we start looking at how much we pay farmers to deliver these things. And we're not mercenary, but we just need to start recognising these longer term periods. And I think Neil will probably talk about support a bit more, but we really do need to know what this stuff looks like and how we manage it and all those things long term. I'll leave you to do it.
Right. Hi everybody. Got my clicker.
Use a little arrow on the keyboard.
Does it? Or can I just use this?
Use this here, that one.
Oh, I can't use that now.
No, I don't know what's.
Oh, right. That one. Okay, that's going to pin me down. Well, thank you. Hi everybody. Yeah. Neil Brown, less of the doctor really. That occurred a long time ago. I'm not your average typical farmer, probably. Kate would say that anyway. But in that I've really only been farming for about 8 years, specialising in poultry. And before that, I was in IT for an awful long time. So I come at this slightly different than many of my fellow farmers. I don't have a great deal of experience in land farming, so that might show up in this conversation. We have a small farm that it's only 90 acres, so I'm right down at the bottom. In one sense, without the poultry unit, it wouldn't be viable. And what I would say is by having the broiler unit there, what it has done is allowed me to invest to a degree in improving the environment of the rest of the farm. And I think even though I'm an intensive farmer, which comes with a label at times, it also means we can do other things with on the environmental side. The farm is 3 generations. My grandfather bought it a long time ago. My father farmed it with another farm, and then my brother farmed it, and then I've come in now and looking after it at this stage. We've had 2 stewardship schemes. The first one we went about 20 years ago, and there we put in over a mile of hedgerow, did the usual things, margins around the fields, and improved the habitat quite significantly, because there was no hedges at all. It was all electric fences when I first came there. And now we've just gone in as of the 1st of January on a new one, which is really focused on the peat restoration. Yeah, so you can see then, in terms of activities, going way back, it was originally a dairy farm, had about 60 cows, I think, on it, I think. And we then, after the quotas and whatever, that disappeared, and it really became purely sort of miscanthus. My brother put a lot of miscanthus in on the ground that would take it, and the rest of it was sort of grazing. And then, as I said, I've moved into the poultry side since. So if you look at the current land use, we've got arable that is actually rented out, and we gross wheat. It's currently got what's it got on it at the moment? It's got oilseed rape. Then we have what I call failed arable, which used to have the miscanthus, but my brother failed to be able to harvest it for about 3 years in a row, simply too wet to get on. He tried to drain it. We have, as I think Kate talked about, all this land is usually in the past been drained. We're part of a sort of drainage scheme, and that's all about trying to dredge the ditches and downstream and whatever. That's not really working very much anymore. It's struggling, and it's become more difficult because some of the ownership of the waterways below us is now preventing that kind of drainage to occur, so it's more difficult to get rid of the water. And then we've got fields which are meadow, which are decent meadow land, which you can graze quite easily. And then we have the rest, which is what we call the wetland pasture, which is really where we're going to be focusing today. Linking it to the deep pit, that is, if you go back to Kate's slide, you would see a little spot where we are. But you can see a lot of the land there is registered as being deep peat, although, as Kate says, it's not that accurate. What is the motivations for me looking at it? Well, there are, as we've already talked, limits to the land productivity of that wetland. You can only do so much, particularly if you can't drain it and it's struggling to drain. So that obviously, if there's an alternative that can provide more income, then farmers, I think, generally would look at that. And there is obviously availability of funding through the high-level schemes at the moment to do that. And it does, yeah. We are, believe it or not, farmers do like to see the improved habitats. We've seen it, I think, over the years, Bentley, as the farm's called, really improve, and it's been a joy. We've now got lapwing coming down on some of the land, and I spent far too long with my binoculars and camera. So that's nice to see, and we do really enjoy that. There is the potential for this carbon storage. Clearly, we can lock this carbon in, and whether or not we're able to join a scheme and make some money out of that, I don't know. And as I said, it's early days really for us as a small farm. And there is the potential for cluster. Unfortunately, I've got 8 neighbours that on the periphery of my land. That's just how many landowners we've got around us, of all types and creeds. One of them is already in the scheme, so we've already got a potential cluster there on the east of the farm. The others, some are looking at it, others are not at all interested, and some of them are fearful of it. So anyway, if we look at key to this is water, and we are a lowland farm. There's plenty of drains and springs and ditches and such like around there. But part of this, if we're going to make it work in terms of restoring the peat, we've got to be able to hold that water. So that's really important. Right in the middle, that's the first field that I'll talk about. That is the one that was failed arable. So effectively, it started off as a field which we tried to kill everything. Killing the miscanthus took some doing to start from there. Then we've got a field below it, which is a wetland meadow, and the field above that as well, next to the farm. Yeah, so 3 fields that we're looking at the moment. If we look at the first one, we've gone back to using the old field names, which we found on a Victorian map. So we're calling that Butfield Meadow. And that, as you can see, when this photograph was taken, that was, I think, miscanthus still there, but it was very difficult, if not impossible, to harvest. It tends to naturally flood during the winter as it stood. So what we tried to do, well, that's what it looks like at the moment. So you can see we're at very early stage in that we did have a few delays at the beginning in terms of getting information through. I think support is really key to us, particularly if you're not an experienced arable, land farmer. We do need support in terms of what we need to do. But at the moment, that's what it looks like. The intention really is to put in a sluice gate on this ditch at the top and raise the water level up to 1 metre if we can. There is springs supplying water into that, as well as drains coming from other land. Then to put out a ditch and divert the water into the middle of the field, if you like, so that it no longer, that water isn't so much flowing down the ditch, but getting into the peat. And again, trying to re-wet this And then the water will flow potentially through that and down into the next field, we hope. I mean, all of this is, you come up with an idea, and really it's in practicals, who knows whether it's going to work or not. On top of that, we've got to kill all the weeds and residual crop, yet another spraying we need to do before we can get it all, it's full of weeds again at the moment. And then there's quite a lot of work in terms of achieving a seed bed that we can actually then plant seed, because the idea is to plant in some broadcaster pond edge seed mix. And this has all come from advice through Natural England. That's where we're getting our support on this. Yeah. Then the field south of it, the same thing applies again. We're hoping that the water will roll through and keep going. We may have to put some drains through the hedgerow, for instance, to try and help that. This tends to, again, naturally flood during the winter months. And then, if you like, join the ditch at the bottom end. That's the sort of intention. So again, we've got to prepare for oversowing. This time, because it's already a meadow, we're not starting from scratch, but we've got to, now the advice is to graze that right down, or cut it right down to its almost bare, and in fact 50% of the bare ground, so that when we come to sow it, again, we can get the seed to take. And clearly this seed is extremely expensive, so what we're hoping, we want to get this right. So any technical advice and support, please, would be welcome. The other field next to the farm, a little bit more complicated in some ways, because one of the things you've got to understand is what's going on in terms of drainage to start with. We currently have a spring in that field that fills a well, and that has been the water supply to the farm for many, many years. And that the offset from any overflow from that spring then runs down the drains into the ditch. We also have other drains, some of which we don't know where they are. That's one of the things, is some of these drains go back many years, and I've had a go at the old water divining, and it's amazing actually. It seems to work, and I've no idea how. But what you can see there, for instance, on the top right here, is that we are draining a field above it, and that does need to be drained, because that's not in the scheme, and we want to contain that to be able to farm it as well as we can. So what we've got to do is replace some of those drains with closed drains. It's a closed walled pipe, as I call it, that actually ensures that we can still drain that land, but it doesn't necessarily won't drain the rest of the land. But then we may well want to be able to divert that out if we can, potentially put a sluice gate at the bottom end so that we can control that flow of water to get the right level. And also let the spring overflow potentially divert that, so that's going into the field as well. A lot of this is sort of hypothetical, because you don't really know until you do it what's going to happen. So, learning point so far, I think I've already said we need timely support. It was real fault, but it was a delay before we got some paperwork back from Natural England, and therefore I was under the wrong impression that we couldn't do certain things, which meant we lost some time there. But all along the line, I think we're not even quite sure what we're trying to achieve here, because we don't know what it's going to look like. So we need support, but we also need flexibility to come back and say, well, what do we do next? One thing you really have to do is consider the impact on neighbours. You think I've got 8 neighbours. I mean, some of them are concerned, am I going to take their water, or am I going to flood them more? Really important to involve them, talk to them, either get them on your side or at least reassure them that there could be mitigating circumstances. I mean, for instance, if we find that they're getting too much water, we may have to put a pump in to try and resolve that. Or, ideally, try and get them on your side and join into the cluster and do the same thing. Yeah, I think we already talked existing drainage. Where is it? What's it going to do? And how do you change that? There is, I find, within the scheme, limits in it. The flexibility is not what we'd like, really. The capital scheme, you can't, for instance, put in contingency. For instance, if we needed to put in a pump, no, you can't do that. And things like, they come up with grazing units, so we're allowed 10 or 5 cattle to graze this. Well, I don't know whether that's going to work or not, to keep it down. And you'd really like to be able to have that interaction where you can say, well, look, it would be better if we had this. But so there's a certain amount of limitations, I think, within the schemes at the moment. And of course, uncertainty of the outcome. Will it work? What will it turn out to look like afterwards? And given that there's been one of the issues you've got is you're fighting the nutrition in the ground, because it's obviously over the years been fertilised and whatever. So it's going to take a long time for that to dissipate before, you know, as I understand it, peat bogs really require low nutrition to get the right type of growth. So this is obviously going to start off as a meadow, and then over time, I don't know, we'll have to see. You could tell me maybe. And then I think the one thing that I did want to end up with is the long-term risk. I mean, we're putting this into the scheme. Is there potential for it to be then said, right, designated as ground that can't be farmed anymore? So what happens then? Is there some way in which I can retain the income to compensate, to cover that, or not? In which case, am I giving up land for the greater good? That's not really fair in one sense. And also, what will it do to the value of the land, actually, and the farm? So there are concerns. So we may get to a stage where we say, well, what do we do now? Do we pull out of it, which you really wouldn't want to do, because we can't see a financial, you know, balanced approach in the future? Okay.
Thank you very much. So we've got time for a couple of questions.
Sorry. Stand in front of the. You stand in front of the. So they can see.
Oh,
you.
right.
Just here. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I didn't realise.
Right, okay, so
Have you made inquiries with in relation to the elms scheme? Because the public goods this is supposed to provide. If you were to do all this work, any comments back in relation to that? Because it looks as though you're suffering from the point you don't know whether to make a decision because of the viability of the future scheme.
I think at the time, you know, elms doesn't seem to be that clear. I mean, I've been involved in some of the working groups early on, and it keeps evolving. What they did say is the HSS is the early stepstone towards elms. So I don't know. I'm taking a risk at the moment, really.
I think the tier that we're really interested in as farmers is the local nature recovery, and yet that's the one that we know absolutely the least about at the moment, because I think that's the one that's going to unlock bigger projects. SFI at the moment is looking very, lightweight scheme, which covers various bits and bobs. But so yeah, that's where we really need some information at the moment.
If the information is correct in relation to carbon storage, then surely it is far more viable longer term to do this.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that.
Yeah.
Well, I hope, yeah.
When you look at the numbers that Robert presented at the beginning, I mean, it's really important, this stuff, and it's got a really important long-term function, but at the moment we're just not seeing the sort of opportunities to unlock it financially. That's the problem.
Is it comprehension at that level, within that silo?
Don't know. Don't know.
So, please say your name or where you're from.
Sorry.
I'm off the Country London Business Association. It's probably a similar question because it's back to Renee about how something like the Peatland Code will work with the project that you just described. So obviously landowners and farmers, and they're definitely keen on this stacking of public and private finance. How does something like the Peatland Code work with that project?
Any other questions?
Yeah, answer to
No,
that.
no, we can't answer that. Give Renaud that one.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. That's
Okay, thank you.